The emergency veterinary tent glowed under harsh fluorescent lights in the remote Montana wilderness, casting long shadows across the makeshift operating table. Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Army medic turned wildlife veterinarian, worked with steady hands despite the exhaustion etched across her weathered face. Before her lay two critically ill big cat cubs, their breathing shallow and labored, their once magnificent coats now dull with fever. What made this scene extraordinary wasn't just their dire condition, but what these cubs represented, a discovery that would challenge everything the scientific community believed about North American wildlife. Sarah's calloused fingers, scarred from her tours in Afghanistan, moved with military precision as she adjusted the IV drip feeding antibiotics into the smaller cub's dehydrated body. The larger twin stirred restlessly, his amber eyes flickering open briefly before closing again in pain. Their distinctive ear tufts and oversized paws told a story that seemed impossible, yet the evidence lay before her on the examination table. These weren't ordinary mountain lion cubs, nor were they the lynx that occasionally wandered down from Canada. The facial structure, the body proportions, the unique markings, everything pointed to a species that officially didn't exist in these mountains. The portable radio crackled with static as other researchers checked in from various points across the Glacier National Park backcountry. Sarah barely heard them. Her attention was completely focused on the medical readings that painted a grim picture. Both cubs were fighting severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what appeared to be exposure-related pneumonia. Their body temperature fluctuated dangerously, and their heart rates were erratic. Without immediate intervention, they wouldn't survive the night. Outside the tent, the Montana wind howled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of approaching snow. Sarah had seen death too many times, in field hospitals overseas and in countless wildlife rescues since returning home. But something about these cubs struck her differently. Perhaps it was their impossible presence in this ecosystem, or the way they seemed to cling to each other even in their weakened state. The smaller cub's paw rested protectively over his brother's neck, a gesture so human-like it made Sarah's chest tighten. As she prepared another dose of medication, Sarah caught sight of fresh scratches on the tent's exterior. Something had been circling their makeshift clinic throughout the night. Something large, persistent, and clearly unwilling to abandon these dying cubs. The mystery of what these animals were had just deepened considerably, and Sarah was beginning to realize she was at the center of a discovery that would rewrite the textbooks. 3 months earlier, the autumn colors painted the Rocky Mountain landscape in brilliant reds and golds as Sarah Chen hiked the familiar trails of her childhood. After 2 tours as a combat medic and years of veterinary school funded by the GI Bill, she had returned to the wilderness that raised her. Her grandmother's old cabin, nestled in a valley 20 miles from the nearest road, had become her sanctuary and her base of operations for wildlife research. Sarah's hiking boots crunched through fallen leaves as she conducted her weekly wildlife survey, documenting the local fauna for the Montana Fish and Wildlife Department. Her military training had taught her to notice details others missed, the subtle signs of animal movement, the patterns that revealed stories of survival and struggle. That crisp October morning, she noticed something that made her freeze mid-step. Massive paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth near Willow Creek, far larger than any mountain lion tracks she'd encountered. The stride length suggested an animal of considerable size and weight, yet the print structure was unlike anything in her field guides. The claws were partially retracted, the pad shape distinctly feline, but the overall dimensions seemed impossible for this region. Sarah photographed the tracks from multiple angles, her scientific curiosity overriding her initial disbelief. Following the trail upstream, Sarah discovered more evidence of the mysterious animal's presence. Claw marks scored the bark of aspen trees at heights that would require a cat standing nearly 6 feet tall on its hind legs. Scattered around the base of the trees were the remains of an elk calf, the kill pattern showing the precise neck bite characteristic of large felids. But the feeding behavior was unusual, methodical, almost ritualistic, with certain portions of the meat carefully buried under layers of pine needles and dirt. Her radio crackled to life, startling her from her investigation. Jake Morrison, a fellow researcher stationed 15 miles south, reported unusual vocalizations echoing through his valley the previous night. Deep, resonant calls that didn't match any documented North American species. The sounds had continued for hours, seeming to originate from multiple locations, as if different animals were communicating across vast distances. Sarah made camp that evening at the edge of a meadow, her military-issued sleeping bag providing warmth against the dropping temperatures. As darkness settled over the mountains, she heard them, the same haunting calls Jake had described. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind like ancient songs. Something extraordinary was living in these mountains, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about North American wildlife. The discovery came at dawn on November 15th, when Sarah's motion-activated trail camera captured footage that would change her understanding of the impossible. Reviewing the memory card over her morning coffee, she nearly dropped her mug as the grainy night vision images revealed a magnificent creature moving through the frame with fluid grace. The animal was enormous, easily twice the size of a mountain lion, with distinctive rosette patterns barely visible across its muscular flanks. But it was the facial structure that made Sarah's breath catch, the broad head, prominent jaw, and unmistakable build of a jaguar. Jaguars hadn't been documented this far north in over a century. The last confirmed sighting in the United States had been in Arizona, nearly 2,000 miles south of where Sarah now sat staring at undeniable proof. Yet here was video evidence of not just one, but what appeared to be a breeding pair moving through the Montana wilderness with the confidence of apex predators completely at home in their territory. Sarah immediately contacted Dr. Marcus Webb, her former professor and now director of the North American Large Carnivore Project. His initial skepticism crumbled as she transmitted the high-resolution images through encrypted channels. Within hours, Webb was coordinating with federal wildlife officials, but Sarah had already made a crucial decision. She would continue monitoring the jaguars alone until a proper research protocol could be established. Too many rare species had been lost to premature human intervention and media attention. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. For 3 weeks, Sarah tracked the pair through increasingly treacherous terrain as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. The female, whom Sarah had begun calling Luna for her nocturnal hunting patterns, was noticeably pregnant. Her mate, a massive male Sarah, dubbed Atlas for his incredible size, remained constantly vigilant, marking territory with scent signatures that spoke of generations of felines who had somehow survived in these hidden valleys. The couple had established their den in a series of interconnected caves beneath a granite overhang, invisible to satellite imagery and protected from the harsh mountain weather. Sarah observed from a distance as Atlas brought fresh kills to Luna, who had grown sluggish in the final stages of pregnancy. Their behavior patterns matched documented jaguar social structures, yet they had adapted to environmental conditions no jaguar was supposed to survive. On December 3rd, Sarah's thermal imaging equipment detected the heat signatures of newborns in the den. Luna had given birth to twins, marking what was likely the first jaguar cubs born in the northern United States in over a century. The miracle of their existence would soon become a fight for their survival. The winter that followed proved merciless even by Montana standards. Sarah documented temperatures dropping to 30 below zero, with snow accumulating to depths that buried fallen trees and transformed the landscape into an unforgiving Arctic wilderness. Through her telephoto lens and thermal cameras, she watched Luna struggle to maintain her milk production while Atlas ventured farther from the den each day, his hunting expeditions growing longer and more desperate as prey became scarce. The cubs, now 6 weeks old, had developed the distinctive rosette patterns of their species, their coats thick with winter fur that nature had somehow equipped them with, despite jaguars being tropical cats. Sarah observed through her equipment as Luna taught them to stay deep within the cave system during the worst storms, their body heat creating a microclimate that kept them barely warm enough to survive. The larger cub, more adventurous and robust, often explored the outer chambers of the den. His smaller sibling remained closer to Luna, seeming to sense his own vulnerability in this harsh environment. Atlas's hunting patterns revealed the extraordinary adaptation this jaguar family had undergone. Unlike their Amazonian relatives who primarily hunted along riverbanks, Atlas had learned to take down elk and deer in deep snow, using terrain features to ambush prey much larger than traditional jaguar targets. Sarah documented him caching kills in natural freezers created by overhanging rocks and snowdrifts, a behavior never recorded in jaguar populations elsewhere. The family's communication system fascinated Sarah as much as their survival strategies. Luna's calls to Atlas carried across miles of frozen wilderness, their frequency and duration encoding information about the cub's condition, food needs, and potential threats. Atlas responded with deep, rumbling vocalizations that seemed to reassure Luna during his extended absences. The cubs developed their own repertoire of sounds, from the standard jaguar chuff greeting to unique whistles that seemed specific to their mountain environment. By February, Sarah noticed troubling changes in the family dynamics. Luna appeared thinner despite Atlas's successful hunts, and her movements around the den had become sluggish. The smaller cub's growth had plateaued, while his larger brother continued developing normally. Through her spotting scope, Sarah could see Luna spending more time lying motionless while the cubs nursed, her breathing appearing labored even during rest periods. The mountain's isolation, which had protected this remarkable family for generations, was now becoming their greatest threat. Spring seemed impossibly distant, and Sarah realized she was witnessing not just an extraordinary adaptation, but potentially its tragic end. March arrived with a late blizzard that buried the mountains under an additional 4 feet of snow, sealing the jaguar family's fate. Sarah's thermal imaging revealed a devastating change in the den's heat signature patterns. Luna had stopped moving entirely for periods lasting 12 to 16 hours, her body temperature fluctuating in ways that suggested severe illness. The cubs, now 3 months old but still completely dependent on their mother's milk, had begun losing weight rapidly. Atlas's behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate. Sarah tracked him through her scope as he attempted hunts in impossible conditions, struggling through snowdrifts that reached his chest. His usual calculated patience had been replaced by frantic energy as he ranged farther from the den than ever before. On several occasions, Sarah watched him return empty-handed after days of hunting, his massive frame visibly diminished by exhaustion and hunger. The breaking point came when Sarah's motion sensors detected Atlas leaving the den and not returning for 72 hours. Through her night vision equipment, she could see Luna barely lifting her head when the cubs attempted to nurse. The smaller cub had stopped vocalizing entirely, lying motionless against his mother's side. His larger brother continued trying to rouse Luna with small paws and desperate mewing sounds that carried clearly through the thin mountain air. Sarah faced an impossible decision that tested every principle of wildlife research ethics. Non-interference protocols demanded she document the family's decline without intervention, preserving the scientific integrity of observing natural selection in action. But her medical training and military experience had ingrained a different imperative. When lives hung in the balance, action was required regardless of bureaucratic guidelines or research parameters. The final catalyst came through her telephoto lens on March 18th. Luna had been motionless for over 18 hours, her breathing so shallow it was barely detectable through thermal imaging. The larger cub had begun dragging his unconscious sibling toward their mother's belly, trying desperately to position him for nursing. But Luna's body had already begun the shutdown process of severe malnutrition and what appeared to be pneumonia brought on by prolonged stress and exposure. Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her career. She gathered her emergency veterinary supplies, loaded her snowshoes and winter survival gear, and began the treacherous 4-mile trek through waist-deep snow toward the den. She was about to violate every research protocol she'd ever sworn to uphold, but some things transcended scientific methodology. These cubs represented possibly the last northern jaguars in existence, and she would not let them die on her watch. The approach to the den required every survival skill Sarah had learned in Afghanistan and the Montana wilderness combined. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness, her headlamp creating a narrow cone of light in the swirling snow. Each step had to be calculated carefully. Too fast, and she might trigger an avalanche on the steep slopes. Too slow and hypothermia would claim her before she reached the cubs. The temperature had dropped to -22 degrees, and her breath formed ice crystals that clung to her balaclava. As she climbed the final ridge leading to the cave system, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. A deep, territorial roar echoed from somewhere in the darkness below. Atlas had returned. Through her night vision scope, she could see his massive silhouette pacing frantically outside the den entrance, his distress calls carrying a note of desperation she had never heard from him before. He had discovered Luna's critical condition and was exhibiting behavior that defied every textbook description of jaguar responses to mortality. Sarah faced the most dangerous moment of her life. Atlas weighed over 200 pounds and possessed jaws capable of crushing a skull with a single bite. Cornered with his dying mate and vulnerable cubs, he represented a threat that her military training had never prepared her for. But retreat meant certain death for the cubs, and possibly the extinction of the last northern jaguar population in North America. She made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation. Removing her rifle from her shoulder, Sarah placed it deliberately in the snow 10 feet away from her position. She then activated a high-powered LED floodlight, illuminating herself completely while keeping her hands visible and empty. The message was clear. She was not a threat, and she was making herself completely vulnerable to demonstrate her intentions. Atlas's roar shattered the mountain silence as he spotted her. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, the massive jaguar stood motionless, his amber eyes reflecting the LED light like golden fire. Sarah remained perfectly still, her veterinary bag at her feet, speaking in the calm, steady tone she had used with wounded soldiers in combat zones. She was gambling her life on the theory that Atlas's intelligence would overcome his protective instincts, that he would somehow understand she was there to help rather than harm. The standoff ended when a weak cry echoed from deep within the cave, one of the cubs calling for its mother. Atlas's ears swiveled toward the sound, and in that moment of divided attention, Sarah saw her chance to prove her intentions. Sarah moved with deliberate slowness, keeping her eyes averted from Atlas's direct gaze while reaching for her veterinary bag. The massive jaguar watched every motion with predatory intensity, but something in his posture had shifted from pure aggression to wary assessment. When she withdrew a collapsible water bowl and filled it with electrolyte solution, Atlas's nostrils flared as he processed the unfamiliar scents of medical supplies and sterilized equipment. The breakthrough came when Sarah placed the bowl halfway between herself and the cave entrance, then retreated several steps. Atlas approached cautiously, his massive paws silent despite the frozen ground. He sniffed the liquid thoroughly before lapping tentatively, his desperation for clean water overriding his wariness. That simple act of accepting her offering created the first bridge of trust between them. Emboldened, Sarah began speaking in low, steady tones as she unpacked her emergency medical kit. She had treated wounded soldiers who couldn't understand English, relying on vocal patterns and body language to convey reassurance. Atlas's ears tracked her voice while his eyes remained fixed on her movements. When she held up a preloaded syringe of antibiotics, he growled softly but didn't retreat. The next hour became a delicate dance of incremental trust building. Sarah would advance 2 steps toward the cave, then retreat 1, allowing Atlas to become accustomed to her presence. She left trail rations and canned meat at intervals, creating a pathway of offerings that spoke to his immediate need to feed his family. Atlas consumed everything she provided, but never took his attention completely off her position. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The turning point came when Luna's labored breathing echoed from deep within the cave, followed by the weak mewing of the cubs. Atlas's massive head turned toward the sounds, and, for the first time, Sarah saw vulnerability replace aggression in his golden eyes. He began pacing between her position and the cave entrance, making soft shuffling sounds that seemed almost conversational. Sarah recognized the behavior from her military experience. Atlas was trying to communicate something beyond his limited ability to express. She responded by activating her portable veterinary light and holding up her stethoscope, then pointing toward the cave. The gesture was unmistakably medical in nature, and Atlas seemed to understand that she possessed tools that might help his dying mate. When Atlas finally stepped aside and allowed her to approach the cave entrance, Sarah knew she had witnessed something unprecedented in human-wildlife interaction. The massive jaguar had made a conscious decision to trust her with his family's survival. 6 months later, the emergency veterinary tent had been replaced by a permanent research station nestled in the valley below the jaguar family's original den site. Sarah stood at the observation deck, watching through high-powered binoculars as 2 healthy juvenile jaguars played in the afternoon sunshine. The cubs, now nearly full-grown at 8 months old, had exceeded every growth milestone despite their traumatic start to life. The smaller twin, whom Sarah had named Cisco for his curious nature, had developed into a sleek, intelligent hunter who favored the stealth techniques his mother had perfected. His brother Diego possessed their father's massive build and direct hunting style, but both cubs exhibited behavioral adaptations that made them perfectly suited for mountain survival. Their winter coats had grown thicker than any jaguar population on record, and they had learned to cache prey in snow caves with the efficiency of Arctic predators. Luna had made a remarkable recovery after 3 weeks of intensive medical intervention. The pneumonia that nearly killed her had responded to antibiotics, and proper nutrition had restored her strength and milk production. But the experience had changed her relationship with humans in ways that defied conventional wildlife behavior patterns. She would occasionally approach the research station's perimeter, not seeking food or assistance, but seemingly checking on Sarah's well-being with the same protective instinct she showed her cubs. Atlas maintained his role as the family's primary provider and protector, but his territory now included a buffer zone around the research station. Sarah's radio collar data showed he regularly patrolled the area where she worked, eliminating potential threats before they could approach her camp. The massive jaguar had somehow integrated her presence into his definition of family safety, treating her as an ally worthy of his protection. The scientific implications of the family's existence had attracted researchers from around the world, but Sarah maintained strict protocols limiting human contact. The jaguar family represented not just a biological miracle, but a successful model for human-wildlife coexistence that challenged traditional conservation approaches. Federal wildlife agencies had granted the population-protected status, designating the entire valley as critical habitat for North America's most northern jaguar family. As evening approached, Sarah watched Cisco and Diego return to their parents near the original den site. 4 generations of jaguars had survived in these mountains through adaptation, intelligence, and now through an unprecedented partnership with humans. The cubs represented hope for a future where conservation meant cooperation rather than separation, where trust could bridge the gap between species in ways science was only beginning to understand. 2 years after that desperate night in the emergency tent, Sarah received a radio call that would forever change her understanding of the jaguar family's legacy. Jake Morrison's voice crackled through the static, barely containing his excitement as he reported thermal signatures indicating multiple large cats moving through the southern drainage system. The reading suggested not just the original family, but additional adults and what appeared to be new cubs. Sarah's heart raced as she gathered her equipment and headed toward the coordinates Jake had provided. The possibility that Luna and Atlas's survival had enabled other jaguars to emerge from hiding represented a conservation miracle of unprecedented proportions. As she hiked through familiar terrain, now marked with well-worn jaguar trails, she reflected on how dramatically the ecosystem had changed since that first camera trap footage 3 years earlier. The discovery exceeded her wildest expectations. Through her telephoto lens, Sarah observed a gathering that redefined everything scientists thought they knew about jaguar social behavior. Luna sat regally on a fallen log, flanked by Cisco and Diego, now fully mature adults approaching breeding age. But they were not alone. 2 additional adult females, both bearing the distinctive rosette patterns and robust build of mountain-adapted jaguars, emerged from the tree line with 4 cubs between them. Atlas commanded the scene from an elevated rock formation, his massive frame silhouetted against the afternoon sky as he surveyed his expanded territory. The new females showed obvious deference to Luna, suggesting a complex social hierarchy that challenged textbook descriptions of jaguars as solitary creatures. The cubs, ranging in age from 6 months to over a year, displayed the same thick winter coats and behavioral adaptations that had enabled Cisco and Diego's survival. Sarah's radio collar data revealed the truth behind this remarkable gathering. The original family's success had attracted other jaguars from hidden populations scattered throughout the Rocky Mountain system. These cats had survived in isolated pockets for generations, their numbers too small and territories too dispersed for breeding success. But Luna and Atlas's proven ability to thrive in mountain conditions had created a beacon that drew scattered survivors together. The implications staggered Sarah as she documented the unprecedented social gathering. She was witnessing the formation of North America's first stable jaguar population in over a century, born from the near-death experience of 2 cubs she had saved in that emergency tent. The trust established between one veteran and one jaguar family had catalyzed the recovery of an entire species thought extinct in the northern regions. The radio in Sarah's research station buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. Webb, but this time his voice carried a tone she had never heard before. Pure wonder mixed with scientific vindication. The genetic samples Sarah had collected over the past year had revealed something extraordinary. These weren't just surviving jaguars. They represented a distinct subspecies that had evolved specifically for mountain survival, possessing genetic markers found nowhere else in the world. Standing at her observation post as the sun set behind the peaks, Sarah watched the extended jaguar family settle into their evening routines. Luna approached the research station's perimeter one final time, her golden eyes meeting Sarah's through the binoculars. In that moment of connection, Sarah understood that she had been chosen as much as she had chosen to help. The bond formed during that desperate winter night had created something unprecedented, a partnership between species that redefined the boundaries of wildlife conservation. The mountain wind carried the deep, resonant calls of the jaguars as they communicated across their expanded territory. Cisco's distinctive whistle echoed from the northern ridge, answered by Diego's powerful roar from the southern valley. Their voices joined those of their new family members in a symphony that spoke of survival, adaptation, and hope. Sarah picked up her journal and wrote the final entry of her most important research project. Today marks 3 years since I made the decision that changed everything. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from following protocols, but from following your heart. These mountains now echo with sounds that were silenced for over a century. The northern jaguars have returned, and they're here to stay. If this story of courage, survival, and the incredible bond between species moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of wildlife conservation. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest discoveries, and share this video with anyone who believes in the power of compassion to change the world. Together we can ensure stories like Luna and Atlas's continue to inspire future generations of wildlife protectors.